But that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time half of their company died, especially in January and February, being the depth of winter, and lacking houses and other comforts, being infected with the scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage in their inaccommodate condition had brought upon them. So as there died, sometimes 2 or 3 of a day in the aforesaid time, that of 100 and odd persons, scarce 50 remained.
Hello and welcome back to Historical USA. I'm Lisa Weekland, your historian and guide through this remarkable story of Thanksgiving. Now, in our last episode, we explored the indigenous perspective. What was the world, this new world in North America, like before the Pilgrims? So if you have not watched that episode, I highly recommend you go and check that out first. That is part 1 of this 4-part series. And you can click on it here up in the corner or go and visit the description below and I will put the link there for you. Now today, in part 2 of our series, we're stepping into the shoes, or the sturdy buckled shoes, of the Pilgrims themselves. We are going to follow their journey from persecution in England, through hardship and hope in the Netherlands, across the stormy Atlantic Ocean, and into the heart of their first difficult year in the New World. We'll uncover why they left everything behind, what life was really like on the Mayflower, the truth about Plymouth Rock, and what actually happened at that famous first Thanksgiving. So settle in, because this is not just a story about religious freedom. It's a tale of economic struggle, cultural identity, and the survival against all the odds. And as always, I will be sharing some surprising facts and some stories you won't find in your average history book. Imagine England in the 17th century, a land of grand cathedrals, royal decrees, and a church that was as much a part of government as the monarchy itself. For a small group of devout Christians known as the Separatists, this was an actual huge problem. See, they believed that the Church of England was still way too close to Catholicism despite the Reformation, and that true believers should form independent congregations free from control of the state. But see, this was not up for a theological debate in England. Under the Act of Uniformity, it was actually illegal not to attend official Church of England services. Fines, imprisonment, and even execution awaited those who defied state church. The Seditious Secretaries Act of 1592 was aimed directly at groups like the Separatists, and leaders such as William Brewster and John Robinson faced constant surveillance, fines, and threats. William Bradford, who would later become the chronicler and the governor of the Plymouth colony, described this persecution as so severe that, quote, former afflictions were but a flea biting in comparison. Homes were watched, people were arrested, and livelihoods were completely destroyed. For these men and women, the choice was stark. Conform, face ruin, or flee. But why would they risk everything? The Separatists' faith was not just a Sunday affair. It was the center of their very lives. They believed that the gathered church, a community of true believers who governed themselves, not by bishops or kings, but by the Bible and their own conscience. This radical idea had profound consequences, not just for them, but for the future of what would become the United States. So where do you go when your own country turns against you? Now, for the Pilgrims, the answer was the Netherlands, a land famous for its religious tolerance and bustling cities. In 1608, after a series of harrowing escapes. And let me tell you, if there's anyone out there looking for an outline or a script for a great TV show, the story of the Pilgrims would be a fabulous, fabulous project. I'm telling you right now. And if you need a screenwriter, hit me up because I would love to. Now back to the story. Now, after a series of harrowing escapes, and I mean harrowing, these included betrayals by ship captains and nights spent in English jail, the separatists would make their way to Amsterdam and soon after Leiden. Now, Leiden was a Dutch city of opportunity and a lot of diversity. Its population had swelled with religious refugees across Europe, and its textile industry was booming. For the Pilgrims, this meant work, often hard, low-paid labor in weaving and spinning. William Brewster even taught English at the university, and John Robinson, their pastor, enrolled for a doctorate and engaged in theological debates that would shape the group's thinking. But life in Leiden was no utopia. Most pilgrims were rural folk, unaccustomed to city life, and more importantly, they didn't speak Dutch, the language. They lived oftentimes in one-room, cramped houses, working 6 days a week. Their children learned Dutch, and to their parents' dismay, began to adopt Dutch customs and attitudes. Bradford lamented that, quote, many of their children were drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses, end quote. Economically, the Pilgrims were struggling. The textile market was volatile, and many found themselves in poverty. With the onset of the 30 Years' War and the end of a truce with Spain threatened the stability of their new home. Politically, the Netherlands was becoming way less stable, with riots and censorship on the rise. Yet Leiden left a lasting mark. Here, the Pilgrims experienced for the first time religious freedom and self-governance. They learned about civil marriage, a Dutch invention, and brought the practice with them to the New World. Some historians even suggest that the annual Leiden celebration of the lifting of the city's siege in 1574, with its mix of Thanksgiving and military parade, influenced the Pilgrims' later harvest festival in Plymouth. But as the years passed, the Pilgrims faced a new crisis: assimilation. As Bradford put it, quote, they wanted their children to be English citizens, not Dutch citizens. By 1617, after more than a decade in the Netherlands, the Pilgrims faced a crossroads. They had religious freedom, but little else. Poverty was grinding, and the future looked bleak. They worried that their community was on the brink of disappearing entirely. And inspired by a sense of mission, they saw the New World as a place to propagate and advance the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. Now, the idea of America, it wasn't new. English merchants had been financing colonies for a decade, whether they were successful or not. And the Pilgrims saw an opportunity to build a new life, free from both persecution and poverty. They really took a chance and hoped to attract others to their cause to create, quote, a better, easier place of living, and to serve as a beacon of faith and Englishness in a distant land. But I don't want to romanticize too much. The Pilgrims were also economic migrants. They would join a money-making enterprise backed by London investors known as the Merchant Adventurers, and they expected a return on their investment. Each colonist over 16 received a share of their joint stock company, with the promise of land and profit after 7 years. The Pilgrims would work for the company, sending back furs, timber, and fish to pay off their debt. So the decision to leave really came down to a mix of faith, fear, hope, and hard-nosed economics. Now you might wonder, how did a group of religious dissenters get permission to even start this colony. I mean, really, the crown could have told the Pilgrims no and imprisoned all of them, but they didn't. Because the answer is a tangled web of royal patents, company charters, and business negotiations. The English crown, more than anything, was eager to expand its influence and profits in the New World. And to be honest, England was kind of late to the colonial game, and they were eager to catch up with their rivals, France and Spain. So the crown would grant charters to joint stock companies like the Virginia Company of London. These companies would pool investors, money to fund that colony, hoping for profit in trade and resources. Now the Pilgrims, through their agent Robert Cushman and John Carver, negotiated for a patent to settle in the northern part of Virginia, what we now call the Hudson River area. The king, James I, agreed to, quote, connive at them and not molest them, provided they behave peacefully, but he would not grant any recognition to their religion. Essentially, the king turned a blind eye to who the people were that were going over to the New World, as long as it financially benefited the king. Now, after delays and setbacks, including the death of their first patent holder and internal disputes within the Virginia Company, the Pilgrims would finally secure a patent in the name of John Pierce in February 1620. This gave them permission to settle under the jurisdiction of Jamestown, but with a degree of autonomy. But here's a twist. When the Mayflower landed far north of its intended destination in what would become Massachusetts, the Pilgrims were technically now outside the boundaries of said patent. Now, this legal limbo would have dramatic consequences, as we'll soon see. So let's set sail. The Pilgrims' journey to America was not a simple hop across the pond. It was a logistical nightmare filled with false starts, leaky ships, and last-minute changes. Now, the original plan called for 2 ships, the Speedwell, purchased in Holland, and the Mayflower, chartered in England. Now, in July of 1620, the Speedwell, along with a group of pilgrims from Leiden, left the Netherlands and stopped in Southampton to meet the Mayflower and additional passengers. Some were separatists and others were strangers, meaning those that were not separatists. But the Speedwell had issues. It was a ship with a storied past and a leaky present. After 2 failed attempts to cross the channel, both ships returned to port, first at Dartmouth, then at Plymouth. The Speedwell there was declared completely unseaworthy, and some passengers actually gave up and decided not to make the trip. The rest, 102 in all, crowded onto the Mayflower, already overloaded with supplies and people. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower finally set sail from Plymouth, England. The passengers had already been living aboard the ship for weeks, and the real journey was just beginning. Again, like I said, it is easy to imagine the Mayflower as a ship full of black-clad, Bible-reading pilgrims, but the reality was far more diverse and contentious. Of the 102 passengers, only 41 were true pilgrims. The rest were strangers. These were hired hands, servants, craftsmen, and families recruited by the merchant adventurers to help make the colony profitable. There were also indentured servants, orphaned children, and even a few animals: 2 dogs, goats, pigs, and chickens. The strangers outnumbered the pilgrims, and their presence was both a blessing and a source of tension. They did bring essential skills: carpenters, soldiers, and farmers, but did not share the pilgrims' religious convictions. This mix would lead to a lot of conflict, especially when the group found out that they were actually outside the jurisdiction of its original patent. Now, among the passengers were some really remarkable individuals that I kind of want to share a little information on. And if you're related to any of them, please, please, please comment below who you are related to from the Mayflower, because I just find it so fascinating. And actually, there's like 32 million descendants in the United States of the Mayflower passengers. So let me know if any of these are your ancestors. First, we have John Howland. This guy is remarkable. He famously would fall overboard during a storm, but by the grace of God, truly, managed to grab a rope and was hauled back to safety. Then there are the Moore children, 4 siblings who were sent as indentured servants after a family scandal in England. Only Richard Moore, though, would survive that first winter, living to an old age in Salem, Massachusetts. The Mayflower really was a microcosm of English society. Faithful and faithless, rich and poor, young and old, all crammed together in a ship actually never meant to hold passengers. And like I said, this was no cruise ship. It was a 100-foot cargo vessel designed to haul wine, goods, and not people. The 102 passengers, plus a crew of about 30, were squeezed into the gun deck, a windowless, low clinging space just 58 by 24 feet. Families hung curtains for privacy, but the stench, the sickness, unwashed bodies, and spoiled food was overwhelming. Ugh. The meals were meager. Hardtack biscuits, salted pork, dried fish, and beer, even for the children, since water kind of quickly spoiled. Fresh food ran out early, and malnutrition and scurvy set in. The ship was battered by storms, and at one point the main beam cracked, threatening to sink the vessel. The crisis, though, was averted by the use of a great iron screw brought from Holland, possibly part of a printing press or a house jack, which was used to brace the beam and save the ship. There were moments of drama and dark humor. One lusty young man, a sailor, who mocked the sick pilgrims, died of disease and was the first to be buried at sea, a fact that Bradford saw as divine justice. Despite the misery, only one passenger actually died during the voyage, a young servant, William Button, but the worst was yet to come. After an agonizing 66 days at sea, the Mayflower sighted land on November 9th, 1620. The passengers intended to settle near the Hudson River, but storms and dangerous shoals forced them to anchor at Cape Cod in what is now Provincetown Harbor. For 5 weeks, the group explored the Cape, searching for suitable places to settle. They had first encounters with the Nauset people, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense. It was here in Provincetown Harbor that the famous Mayflower Compact would be signed, but more on that in a moment. Eventually, the group sailed across the bay and chose a site called Patuxet by the Wampanoag, abandoned after a devastating epidemic known as the Great Dying. The cleared fields and fresh water made it an ideal spot, and the settlers named it Plymouth after the port they departed from in England. And what about that famous Plymouth Rock? Well, despite its iconic status, there's actually no mention of the rock in any of the Pilgrims' writings. The first reference of it comes more than a century later from a 94-year-old church elder named Thomas Fons. The rock had been moved, chipped, and enshrined, but its connection to the Pilgrims is actually more of a legend than an actual fact. Now, back to the Mayflower Compact. The separatists and the strangers constantly clashed. It got so bad that at one point, the strangers threatened to go their own way, leaving the pilgrims to their own devices. But the pilgrim leaders knew that they needed the strangers to survive in this new world. And they decided to draft the Mayflower Compact, which was a brief agreement to form a civil body politique and to enact, quote, just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. The compact was not a constitution, but it was a revolutionary step. It established self-government by majority rule, with loyalty to the king, but authority resting in the community. John Carver was elected as the first governor, and the compact remained the foundation of Plymouth's government until the colony was absorbed into Massachusetts Bay in 1691. Historians have called the Mayflower Compact the world's first written constitution and a seed of American democracy. Its principles of self-government and common consent would echo through centuries. Now, if you think the voyage was hard, winter in Plymouth was an absolute nightmare. These settlers arrived at the worst possible time in the year, with little food and no shelter. Winter was coming, and for months, most lived aboard the Mayflower, ferrying to shore to build houses when the weather allowed. Diseases like a mix of scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through their cramped quarters. By spring, nearly half the passengers and crew had died. Only 6 or 7 healthy people were left to care for the sick at the worst of the crisis. The dead were buried on Coles Hill, their graves disguised to hide the colony's weakness from potential enemy. Among the survivors were remarkable stories of resilience. Susan White, widowed in February, gave birth to Peregrine White, the first English child born in New England. Only 5 women survived to the first Thanksgiving. The Mayflower crew suffered too. About half died before the ship could return to England in April of 1621. But what about that first encounter with the natives? Well, it actually wasn't with the Wampanoag people. The Pilgrims had contact with other indigenous peoples. On Cape Cod, they did encounter the Nauset, who were very weary of the Pilgrims, which was understandable given that English traders had kidnapped a number of their tribe just a few years earlier. In 1614, Thomas Hunt had taken 20 people, actually, from Patuxet and 7 from the Nauset, selling them into slavery in Europe. One of the captives, Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, would later play a crucial role in the colony's survival. The land that the Pilgrims eventually settled had been devastated by the Great Dying, an epidemic that actually killed up to 90% of the local native population in just 3 years, between 1616 and 1619. The cleared fields and abandoned villages the Pilgrim found were a tragic legacy of this catastrophe. By March 1661, the survivors really struggled to rebuild or build anything. But then a remarkable encounter took place. Samoset, a native man from Maine who spoke a little English, walked into the settlement, greeted the Pilgrims, and actually asked for some beer. Soon after, he would introduce them to the Massasoit, the shaman leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, and actually my 12th great-grandfather. And then to Squanto. Squanto became the Pilgrims' interpreter and guide, teaching them how to plant corn, fish, and survive this new land. Massasoit and the Pilgrims would sign a peace treaty that would last more than 50 years, a rare achievement, really, in colonial history. But this alliance was not about friendship. The Wampanoag had been weakened by disease and faced threats from rival tribes. The Pilgrims, for all their hardships, offered a potential ally. The relationship was complex, shaped by necessity, diplomacy, and mutual suspicion. Now let's set the record straight on the first Thanksgiving. In autumn of 1621, after a successful harvest, the 53 surviving Pilgrims held a 3-day celebration. They invited Massasoit and about 90 Wampanoag men, who brought with them 5 deer. The feast included fowl, possibly wild turkey, but more likely ducks and geese, venison, corn, and other foods native to the region. There were games, displays of arms, and mutual entertainment. The Pilgrims did not call it Thanksgiving. For them, the terms referred to a religious day of praying and fasting. The 1621 event was a harvest festival, blending English and native traditions. And really only two primary sources even describe the event: a letter by Edward Winslow and a passage by William Bradford. Both emphasize the abundance and the spirit of gratitude, but neither mentions pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce, or black hats with buckles. The Wampanoag's presence was more likely diplomatic as much as a celebration. Some historians suggest Massasoit's arrival with the 90 men was a show of strength, ensuring that the newcomers understood the balance of power. Over time, the story of Thanksgiving has been mythologized, commercialized, and sometimes contested. For the Pilgrims, it was a moment of relief and hope after a year of unimaginable struggle and loss. For the Wampanoag, it was a partnership of survival, the beginning of a complex and often tragic relationship with the English settlers. So what can we learn from the Pilgrims' journey? Their story is not just one of religious freedom, but of resilience, adaptation, and the blending of cultures. They were flawed, complex, and sometimes contentious people, but their experiment in self-government and community would echo through American history. Next time in part 3, we are going to trace the evolution of Thanksgiving from this colonial period through the founding of the United States and into the Civil War era. We'll see how the holiday became a national tradition and how its meaning has changed. Until then, I'm Lisa Weekland. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you can, please hype this video. That would really help me a ton. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know, are you related to one of the passengers of the Mayflower? Or maybe like me, you're related to one of the natives like Massasoit. Tell me what surprised you most about the Pilgrims. I will see you next time. Bye.